Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to skip right past the politics and the PR spin, and we're going to look directly at the hard, undeniable data behind one of the most resource-intensive industries on Earth. We are breaking down the massive environmental footprint of coal operations. But more importantly, we're going to see exactly how this industry is officially forced to measure and report those risks. Because whether we're talking about active extraction sites, water treatment facilities, or reclaimed mine land, every single physical impact is now meticulously tracked. Okay, let's dive right in. Take a look at this. This is our starting point, the SASB standards, which are now overseen by the International Sustainability Standards Board. You can really think of this as our completely neutral, objective measuring stick. This isn't some activist framework, and it's definitely not industry spin. It is a rigorous financial and sustainability accounting standard. It tells corporate entities exactly what they absolutely must disclose to the public and, of course, to their investors. So, to make sense of this pretty dense accounting standard, we've organized our roadmap for today into 4 main pillars. 1. Tracking greenhouse gas emissions. 2. Water and waste management. 3. Measuring biodiversity impacts. And 4. Tailings storage facility management. All right, let's jump straight into part 1, tracking greenhouse gas emissions. Starting off by looking up at the atmosphere, we've got to focus on the massive direct emissions generated by these incredibly energy-intensive coal operations. And notice just how rigorously the standard categorizes this tracking. If you look at the top rows of this disclosure table, companies are forced to calculate their gross global Scope 1 emissions, as well as the percentage of those emissions that are actually covered under emissions-limiting regulations. So this right here is the very first baseline of accountability. Let's bust some industry jargon really quick. What exactly goes onto that ledger? Well, Scope 1 emissions are the direct, physical emissions coming from sources that a company actually owns or controls. We are talking about the massive diesel equipment moving earth around at the mine sites. We're talking about the methane physically releasing from the coal seams during extraction. And of course, the marine, road, and rail transportation involved in actually moving the product. It's their real-world physical footprint. And listen, the standard is incredibly strict about what gets counted. Companies can't just throw out a broad estimate of their carbon footprint. No way. They must consolidate and report on the 7 specific greenhouse gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. This includes your obvious ones like carbon dioxide, all the way down to sulfur hexafluoride, which, by the way, is a gas that is incredibly potent at trapping heat. Then they have to mathematically convert all of this into metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Moving right along to our second pillar, water and waste management. So, bringing our focus from the atmosphere back down to the surface, we're looking at the intense water consumption and the sheer volume of waste associated with extracting and washing coal. The absolute crucial metric for water is the number 1,000. Why? Well, how does a standard officially define fresh water? According to the framework, it's water that has less than 1,000 parts per million of dissolved solids. This perfectly translates dry accounting metrics into real-world stakes. Tracking exactly how much of this precious, clean resource is withdrawn and consumed is absolutely paramount. And frankly, where that water is taken from matters just as much as how much is used. Companies are required to publicly report the percentage of water they withdraw and consume in regions categorized as having high baseline water stress, which means 40 to 80% stress, versus extremely high baseline water stress, meaning over 80%. If a coal operation is sucking vast amounts of water out of an already parched, drought-stricken region, this standard forces that risk right out into the open for everyone to see. Of course, the sheer volume of water and waste is directly tied to their production levels. Notice the activity metrics categorized here, measured in million metric tons. Whether the operation produces thermal coal for generating electricity or metallurgical coal used to make steel, the massive scale of these operations dictates the immense scale of the water and waste issues that follow right behind them. And speaking of waste, the accounting here is just relentless. Actually, scratch that. It's not just accounting. It's meticulously weighing everything. Companies have to report the total weight in metric tons across all these categories. They track non-mineral waste, like scrap metal and used oil. They have to weigh their waste rock, the low-grade ore they discard during mining. And most critically, they must strictly track hazardous waste. We're talking materials containing heavy metals like arsenic or cadmium, where improper disposal carries massive regulatory, legal, and public health risks. All right, let's get into part 3, measuring biodiversity impacts. Shifting our focus to the ecosystems themselves, because surface mining and mountaintop removal physically alter landscapes and destroy wildlife habitats. One of the most devastating environmental threats in this entire industry is acid rock drainage, or ARD. When surface water hits exposed coal mining waste, it becomes highly acidic and contaminated with heavy metals. So the SASB standard forces companies to look at all their mine sites and disclose exactly what percentage are predicted to experience ARD, what percentage are actively being mitigated, and what percentage are currently under active treatment or remediation. Bottom line, they cannot hide a toxic runoff problem. Let's look directly at the biodiversity impacts highlighted here. This really proves how companies are cornered into absolute transparency. They are explicitly forced to describe their environmental management policies for active sites. And critically, they must disclose if their reserves are located anywhere near ecologically sensitive, protected environments. But, what does near actually mean in corporate reporting? The standard doesn't leave any room for wiggle words here. The magic number is 5. 5 kilometers. That is the strict, undeniable distance used by the standard to define whether an operation is operating dangerously close to a protected conservation site, like a UNESCO World Heritage Site or an endangered species habitat. If a company's coal is within that 5-kilometer danger zone, they must disclose the exact percentage of those reserves. And they have to break it down, first by proved reserves, meaning the highly measured, practically guaranteed deposits, and second by probable reserves, which are the slightly less adequately spaced measurements. If a company's future value relies on digging up land right next to a protected wetland, investors and the public will know exactly what proportion of their business is on the line. Which brings us to our final pillar, Part 4, Tailings Storage Facility Management. This final pillar is all about the immense, frankly terrifying responsibility of managing liquid coal waste. Let's define the stakes here. Tailings storage facilities are essentially massive dams and ponds, holding back fine coal refuse and toxic liquid waste. If one of these structures is compromised and fails, the result is catastrophic. We are talking about a literal tidal wave of toxic waste, destroying local ecosystems, devastating human life, and creating massive entity-crushing financial liabilities. Because the risks are so incredibly high, marvel at the exhaustive accounting required here. Every single facility has to be publicly inventoried across 12 strict data points. Companies must disclose the exact construction method. They must state the maximum permitted storage capacity. They have to list the current amount of tailings stored right this second, and they even have to assign a consequence classification. They are literally grading how bad the disaster would be if the dam broke. And here is the real kicker. Companies cannot just self-report and say, hey, everything looks fine to us. No, the standard demands the disclosure of dates and material findings from the most recent independent technical reviews. These have to be conducted by third parties who had absolutely nothing to do with the design or operation of the facility. If the independent review finds a structural safety issue, that material finding goes straight onto the public record, along with exactly what mitigation measures they are taking to fix it. Finally, the standard checks for worst-case scenarios by tracking emergency preparedness and response plans. Are they actually coordinating with local first responders? Are they running regular evacuation exercises? This proves that a strong safety culture and community preparedness are officially tracked, auditable metrics, not just fluffy PR buzzwords buried on page 40 of a corporate brochure. So let's summarize the journey we've taken today. From greenhouse gas measurements way up in the atmosphere, down to water stress, biodiversity impacts, and the structural integrity of toxic tailings ponds, the SASB standard systematically forces hidden operational risks out into the light. It puts the true physical environmental footprint of coal squarely onto the public ledger. Which leaves us with this final thought. We now have the tools to completely unmask the environmental liabilities of this industry. But if every single environmental risk is perfectly measured, documented, and priced in, does the true cost of coal ultimately outweigh its economic value? I'll leave you to think about how this mandatory, impartial transparency might just fundamentally shift the entire global energy economy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.